You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. I want to thank you for joining me again, and this week we actually have a very, very short reading, but the short reading itself has a lot packed into it, and to really understand a lot of what's going on in this reading, there's a need, a very, very important need here, to understand a lot of the background of what we're reading. So this is the Haftarah, obviously, for Vayechi, and we're reading from 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1 to verse 12. Very, very short reading. You can literally see it's a very short reading. Everyone does this short reading. And when I was looking up the different variations, for next week, for example, for Shmot, there are 3 different practices, and I'm going to have to choose one of them. And I already know which one it will be, but it's going to be a surprise for you for next week. And we are reading about the end of the reign of King David. And there's a lot of background here. There's a lot of understanding kingship in Israel and understanding what the kingship is supposed to represent, at least from the perspective of how the Bible is given to us. For those who might be new to the series, I majored in history of antiquity, and I majored in understanding the historical side of the Book of Kings. And we used to have a lot of discussions about these chapters, and I'm still having discussions about these chapters because, surprise, surprise, during my master's, I'm also doing the Book of Kings again. And but right now I'm doing a lot of work that has to do with the editorial work of the Book of Kings and less about what the text is exactly saying. So we spent quite a while discussing different versions, and I actually, as a recommendation, something really interesting, as this is an exercise that was given to me as a student, we were supposed to compare the Book of Kings in the Masoretic text versus the Book of Kings in the Septuagint, and it's very interesting how the editing work there is quite different, and different sections are presented in other places in the Masoretic text. So it is very, very interesting to see this. However, this specific section is in both texts, both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are actually in the same location with no real changes, and the text itself is it's a composition of 2 different things, I would say. Both are King David's will, but when we study this, it's very interesting how the will itself focuses mostly on a very, very practical yet violent side of kingship, and we have 2 or 3 verses that deal with the overall message that the Bible gives about what kingship is supposed to be. And it's a really interesting thing because you can literally see 2 different layers of what the text is saying. And if you take the academic approach, the insert of what they call the Deuteronomistic school, from the word Deuteronomy, into this text, which raises a lot of questions about what was the original text. And this is a really, really complicated subject that I've been discussing with different colleagues of mine for a very, very long time. I even had some discussions with some professors, people who are experts in this field of understanding dating of text and so on. And I am actually standing in very strong opposition with a lot of these people, because I understand that editorial work was done. I mean, obviously, we're not seeing the entirety of everything. This is something I've been saying for years now. If this is upsetting to someone, I'm really sorry, but I've been saying this for a very long time, that we need to understand that every book of the Bible, except for maybe the Torah, and that's a whole discussion by itself. But the rest of the books of the Bible, especially a book like the Book of Kings, which is, as it's called, the Book of Kings, is a book that's supposed to represent a history. And when you write history, you have to write history from several points. first of all, your history, especially if you're writing down an entire composition of material, your history will be based on oral knowledge and written knowledge. That's usually how most histories happen. And then when it comes to oral and especially written knowledge, when was this material written? And oral knowledge is always very problematic because it keeps on layering. But it doesn't mean that written knowledge doesn't do the same thing as well. However, what's very interesting is with the Book of Kings, we probably see a very interesting process of oral information that was apparently at some point put down into written, because there's questions here. Did someone really sit down as things were happening and writing them down? We usually understand this is not how material was written. When we compare, by the way, historical practices, that we have a much more clear record of how they work. For example, medieval information about occurrences in Europe, for example. There's a very famous thing that used to happen in monasteries around Europe, that people of the monastery would write on plaques a date and an occurrence, and a very, very short entry of the occurrence. And then these short chronologies would be expanded on by someone later on who gathered more information, actually wrote a much larger text. Here we don't really necessarily know exactly how all this happened, and there's a very good chance that we're seeing a combination of oral tradition and written tradition side by side. And without going into the entire debate of when everything was written, and we also have to remember there has to be a division between when something is written to when something is edited to the final product, because there can also be a process throughout time. So even when someone tells you, for example, some more radical scholars who argue that a lot of what we see is from the Second Temple, it doesn't mean that the material itself was composed in the Second Temple. It means that maybe the editorial work was finalized in the Second Temple. And these are divisions which I think a lot of people miss when they have these discussions, because they don't fully understand the process of writing, they don't fully understand the process of historical records and so on. It is, however, known that the Assyrians, for example, and the Egyptians, when they had royal inscriptions, they would record these things a short time after the occurrence, because this was part of the glorification of the king when he did an action, because this was something they had to not only present before the people, mostly they had to present these things before the gods. So a king, before he died, had to record these things. However, we know as a fact that in some of these records there were blatant lies. And this is always, so you always have this problem, who do you also trust historically? I remember I was reading, and I think I mentioned this before, James Hoffmeyer, who brings up two very important points. The first one is that he asks the very, very simple question of, why do we trust all these ancient records, but then when it comes to the Bible we distrust? And then he raises even a much more interesting idea that I never thought of before I read it, was that we asked the question of why don't we really have any inscriptions from kings of Israel, except for a few bits and pieces here and there, including inscriptions that we're not even sure are really from who we think they are, like, for example, the inscription, what's known as the Hezekiah inscription, or the inscription of the water canal, the Shiloh. There's a lot of debate if this is really from King Hezekiah. And again, that goes into the whole discussion of what is recorded in the Bible versus what we find. Could it be that someone else made this? We don't know, but it's a very interesting fact that there's a record written in Paleo Hebrew in a script that we know, in not only script but also language that fits the period. So when people ask the question, was this really from King Hezekiah? We have to ask the question of, so why isn't King Hezekiah's name mentioned here? And that's a really, really interesting question. So Hoffmeyer raises a really interesting point where he says that if we look, for example, at the style of the book of Joshua and how it's structured, especially when we look at the way the battles are described, he says that this is actually very similar to the style of writing found in Egypt and Assyria of royal inscriptions of conquest. And he basically hints to the idea that this is probably how Israelites maintained the knowledge of what was done, instead of writing everything down and then putting up gigantic monuments, they recorded what happened either in song, story, or books, because the glory is not supposed to be given to... Now, I'm adding to some of this, might explain the mentality. The glory is not supposed to be given to the person. The glory is supposed to be given to God. And this is why putting up a gigantic monument because the king did something or the leader did something probably stood in contrast to the ideology presented by the Israelites. So it is possible that we're looking at a difference of culture that caused is the cause or the reason that we see this end result of no inscriptions and so on. So there's a lot of questions that exist in regards to how historical information was recorded by the Israelites, which leads to a lot of speculation in the academic world, which again, I am still not yet qualified enough to go into all these different discussions. However, I am qualified enough to know that these discussions are sometimes, at least my perspective as a person who is trained in history and historical documentation of antiquity, that there is a possibility here that we are not fully understanding the concepts of how this material was passed from one generation to the other. And when people are trying to find a mechanism or a way of comparing the Israelites to the rest of the nations or the rest of the different social groups, we have to understand that the Israelites were probably different. They perceived things differently. And in truth, by the way, what's very, very interesting is if we actually compare the Israelites to the third intermediate period in Egypt after the New Kingdom, which the New Kingdom contained the Ramesside families, or really the Ramesside line, famous Ramses II, one of the most famous pharaohs and so on. In the intermediate, the third intermediate era in Egypt, we actually have a massive decline in writing, and some kings we just know that we have a name, we don't really know much about them. And you would think Egypt, the kingdom of Egypt, almost be referred to as an empire and so on, were actually during that period under Libyan control. The Libyans were not ethnically Egyptian, they actually were Semites, and they invaded Egypt from the west, and they were not very good in keeping records as well. So there's a possibility here that we need to see a difference between the larger empires like Assyria, Hatti, and Egypt versus the smaller kingdoms, which probably had a different ideology of how they maintain information. Now, when we enter this discussion of what was actually going on between King Solomon and King David, we have to understand that this is probably something that was recorded a little bit later, probably by people. Either the story was passed down from the people who stood there, maybe Solomon himself, maybe there was a record of it, and there's even the possibility that because this was a will, that King David did this in front of a whole bunch of people, that there was actually a physical scribe there who wrote this information down. So there is a certain question here regarding what the composition of the text is, but we need to really bring up this question, because one of the big questions that happens is, there are two big questions here. The first big question is, what is the relationship between the first two chapters of the Book of Kings and the Book of Samuel? And when was this information specifically recorded? Now, regarding the second question, I first of all want to touch on the second question, then we'll talk about the first question, because the first question is really interesting as well. But answering the second question, this is obviously highly debated, but there's a really interesting scholar called Professor Moshe Gal-Ciel, who has been arguing for many, many, many years. And he's not the only one who makes arguments like this, but he has been making the argument for many, many years that the majority of the information that we have about King David was recorded very, very close to the time of his life or death. And therefore, this is material that dates back much, much earlier than most scholars try to argue. And he talks about the difficulties that we have in the Book of Samuel in different parts, like, for example, Goliath and what he wore as a uniform and his weapons, which really fit a different era. And there are other difficulties, like, for example, the introduction of King David and so on. But he argues very, very strongly, and he's actually come out now with a book in English about the book of Samuel. It's volume 1. Apparently he's working on several volumes. Book of Samuel is one of his big projects. This is something he's been working on for many, many years. And I had to study his 4-volume book on the book of Samuel when I took a course on the book of Samuel. And he strongly argues in favor of the idea that most of the material in front of us is very, very old. But obviously, as a scholar, he says there was editorial work and things changed throughout time. But that the core of the story, the core of the book, is very, very, very old. Now, obviously, there are other opinions, and we can't go into every single opinion that exists. However, we do need to understand that in the more extreme end of the opinions, we have people who always date things into the Second Temple. This is always very difficult to accept, because when you see Second Temple literature and you see the Tanakh, you notice that there's a difference in language and there's a difference in style. And really, there's an extreme in which people start talking about the 2nd century or 3rd century BCE. That's very, very difficult, because they didn't write in the same type of Hebrew. And when people try to imitate that Hebrew, you can find the flaws in it. So it's very difficult to argue there, but most people go into the idea that there was some early book and it was edited somewhere during the Second Temple, which is an argument that we can understand. Now, you can understand why the editing question is so big here. Now, the first question we had, the relation with the book of Samuel, so this is really interesting, because really, in truth, this chapter shows up after a long story. A chapter goes on for 53 verses about Adoniyahu or Adonijah, who tries to take over the throne. And there are a lot of similarities, a few similarities with the story of Avshalom. And these similarities have caused scholars to wonder, should we really separate the first 2 chapters of the Book of Kings from the rest of the Book of Samuel? And there are two opinions about this. Some say, look, the similarities are very great, or the similarities are very strongly, they have a very strong resemblance to the story of Avshalom, and therefore this is all about the war over the throne, the story of the ascension to the throne, and therefore we need to look at this as one continuous story. Now, there is a side to that, because first of all, Book of Kings was really part of Book Kings 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you actually look at the Septuagint, it's called the Regines 1, or I think it's the Vulgata calls it the Regines 1, 2, 3, 4. And we also have the fact that, it carries on from and King David is old, so it connects us to the previous story, because we're kind of reading about King David towards the latter stages of his kingship in as a king of all of Israel, and now we're stepping into his old age. However, we also have to remember that the material that we have, for example, in Joshua, kind of continues the book of Deuteronomy, and this material that we have in Judges kind of continues the material in Joshua, and Samuel kind of continues the material from Judges, and so on. So it's quite possible that what we're looking at really more is like a flow of information, but really separate books. And there are scholars who argue the opposite, where they say, look, King Solomon is only mentioned really once, and he's only really mentioned because he's part of the story of his birth was part of a very problematic story in the life of King David that was recorded in the book of Samuel, and therefore it's actually maybe preferable to separate these two from one another. And really, the story of the ascension to the throne has nothing to do, and the similarities are more of a mechanism than anything else to delegitimize Adonijah or Adoniyahu as king, the same way Avshalom wasn't king. Really, you shouldn't connect these two pieces together. So we have all these different questions that exist, and obviously the answer will be whatever a person sees more evidence to, and this is very individualized as well. Sometimes one person makes one argument, another person makes another argument, and they never agree in the middle, they never meet in the middle, and they always will disagree with one another. Each one of them will pull to their own direction, and you see this all the time. What do you do with it? The answer is to each his own, really. Sometimes to each his own, and we just have to learn to accept the fact that we disagree on things. So, why do I say all of this? Because it's a really, really interesting entry here. So first of all, we have to understand that most of what we're reading here is still strongly connected to the book of Samuel, and is still strongly connected to everything that happened earlier. We're not reading a disconnected story, but the storyline is already going into a different direction. It's transitioning into the discussion of what happened with kings and what is expected of kings. Because in the book of Samuel, the prophet Shmuel Hanavi points out the different things a king has to be careful of. This is known as the judgment, the rulings of the king, Mishpat HaMelech, there's Chok HaMelech, the laws of the kings, which appears in Deuteronomy, and then we have Mishpat HaMelech, the judgment of the king, the warning he presents what the future kings of Israel might do. And now what we're going to be looking at here is the will of King David, which is very, very gritty, very dark to some degree. And there's a question here of why is it so dark? Why did King David make such a point of pointing out, do the good things to the people who are good to me and do bad things to people who are bad to me? Why is this his will? Why is this specifically his will? And I think the answer is that King Solomon was very, very young and was probably naturally inclined, or probably his father knew, and we're not really reading it directly in the story, we're reading it as a circumstance of how it's described. It's quite possible that King Solomon Melech Shlomo was a very kind person, maybe a little not prepared yet to be king, and King David has to make sure that Solomon actually knows what to do, how to behave, and he's basically giving him the wisdom of the unfortunate issues of being king. So this is not just for him, this is for us as well. This is for us later on understanding the aftermath of kingship. This is like the idea of telling us, here's a warning about kingship. We were warned in the book of Samuel, we've been warned again. King David explains this is politics, this is dirty, this is a horrible thing to be involved in. And this is a massive warning to anyone who wants to be king. You have to understand that this never ends well. And this goes back into the whole dilemma that I think we've discussed here before, but the whole dilemma of kingship in Israel and overall. Not everyone felt comfortable with the idea of kingship. We go back to the parable of Yotam, of Jotham, where he warns about it, that the king in the end will burn everyone. He talks about the different trees. We have this back and forth problem that the book of Judges have. There's no king on the one hand, therefore there's chaos, but then on the other hand, without a king, there's no king, there's chaos, but with a king there can be trouble. Avimelech tries to become king. It gets really, really messy. And I think that we need to understand that, like any form of politics, the Bible is already recording the dilemmas everyone has always had about politics. Though it's not talking about the ideas of democracy, it's talking about the idea of oligarchy and monarchy and so on, we still are looking at the problem of freedom for the people versus order versus each person to his own versus centralization. And centralization has its good sides, it has its bad sides. There are people who are to this very day, people are pro-government, people are anti-government, people who want government, but small government, people want a big government. These are the dilemmas that everyone's always had, because there isn't really a perfect way of governing anyone at any given time. There's never a way of answering everyone's needs and everyone's requests, and there's always the pulling and pushing of politics and so on. And King David, unfortunately, has to pass down these facts to King Solomon. But he also has to pass down one much more important fact, which is inserted here. And this is why, though I understand the argument that many scholars make regarding a bunch of verses here that they say come from the Deuteronomist, it's quite possible that we're just looking at something that King David did say, but then someone decided, maybe, again, because remember, a lot of this is oral. We don't necessarily know if was someone actually sat down and wrote this. We also understand that there's a message being sent out to us, that it's possible that this was slightly reworded to reminisce to us the book of Deuteronomy, to remind us more of the book of Deuteronomy, and therefore the wording was slightly altered. But again, this is the debate that we can have until we're blue in the face. What exactly is the origins of everything? But he points out something really, really important. He says, at the end of the day, if you are loyal to God, everything will be organized. Everything will have its place. No one will really have a need or a will or an interest to undermine you, undercut you, or even cause trouble. That if you follow God, if you are loyal to His instructions, if you're loyal to His Torah, if you're loyal to Him, at the end of the day, all will sort itself out. Because King David, though his kingship was very, very troublesome, he still gave his son a relatively peaceful kingdom. And the most of the trouble was trouble from the inside his house. The moment Shaul was gone, he still had trouble with that because that's something that remained. But really, the problems that King David had, and this is the wisdom he's trying to give his son, and he's actually telling his son, listen, we have to clean up the damage that we created here as well. And there's a lot of connections here because Solomon himself is the offspring of the woman that because of that situation, King David was all in trouble. So there's a kind of like an attempt to close up some kind of a problematic cycle here through a son that he knew that it was promised to him that this son would be a son of peace, but he still needs to tell him that he needs to kind of clean up the damage that existed to finalize that part of what happened. But he's pointing out to him the most important thing, and he says the most important thing is your loyalty to God. He said, I remained king because I was loyal. I made massive mistakes. And you need to learn to get rid of the mistakes. Learn what each one of these people did. Learn how I interacted with them. And learn from my mistakes so you can learn better. So you can do things better. So you don't make the mistakes that I made. And this is probably one of the most important messages for our generation as well. That the wisdom of our fathers, though our generations, the younger generations, we know more and we understand more and we have access to more, it doesn't mean that we're better. It doesn't mean that we understand better. It doesn't mean that we have experience. It doesn't mean that we really know anything. I grew up with my parents until my parents left Israel. At the age of 17 and a half, I was left alone. It took me several years to learn things that around the age of 17, 18, 19, 20, you learn these things, but you do it while having your parents still kind of behind you. But I finished my teenage years and I was more or less by myself. And it took me longer to learn certain things about the world because I didn't have my parents, especially my father's wisdom to guide me into how to interact correctly and how to respond correctly to things and so on. And this is really what his father's doing. He's passing on his own wisdom. He's telling him, these are the mistakes that I made. And some of these mistakes, unfortunately, have to be rectified in a violent way. And this is part of the overall message of the Bible. This is why usually when you have a transition point from one leader to the other, that leader usually gives some kind of a speech. This is really the last speech that we have in the Bible. We have Abraham speaks to Yitzchak. Yitzchak blesses Yaakov. Yaakov blesses his sons. Moshe gives a speech. Yehoshua gives a speech. Shmuel gives a speech. King David gives a speech to his own son, but the message is still to us as well, that we need to learn to fear God, to learn from the wisdom of the previous generations, to learn from their mistakes, to understand how things work correctly. And King David said, listen, if it wasn't for the mistake with Bathsheba, I would have been a king of peace for my entire life. But I made a massive mistake here. And it allowed people who were close to me to also manipulate me and so on. So he warns him. Fortunately, King Solomon doesn't heed to the majority of this warning, and this is why he gets into trouble as well, and his children get into trouble and so on. Unfortunately, as humans, we don't always learn, but we need to read these words and try to understand the larger message being given to us. So we start from verse where it says, "Vayikrevu yemei David lemut." The days of David drew near to dying. So this is not that he gave this and suddenly he just died on the spot. No, he was alive for at least a bit of a while. So King Solomon was actually co-regent. He was crowned while his father was still king, which means there was co-regency here, which this is something very, very common in kingship, which messes up our ability to calculate the years. So we don't know how long after this occasion King David was alive, and we also don't necessarily know how long before this stage was King Solomon crowned, which means that every time we see a king, there's a chance of co-regency. For example, with King Uzziyahu, his son and grandson, so Achaz and Yotam, if I remember the names correctly, were co-regents as well, even though Uzziyahu was king, or Azariah was king for a very, very long time. So when people try to calculate the years, and I'm very sure there are people who listen to this who've been trying to calculate the years, we actually have a problem. Some of these years probably overlap. So there's a bit of a difficulty here. So we're drawing near to the days of his death. Vayetzav et Shlomo beno le'emor, and he commanded, and he gave a will from the word tzav, to command someone. The word for will is tzava'ah. They're all connected to one another. So he commanded his son Solomon, saying, Anochi holech bederech kol haaretz. So he uses a metaphor. I am going in the path of the way of the land. It's a metaphor, the idea of I'm going to die, because it's the way everything goes in life. There's one thing we know, the end is known to all of us. At the end, I have a friend who studies with me in one of the classes, and he's an older man, and he always says to me, remember, the end is known. And I said to him, that is very, very true. It says, V'chazakta ve'itali, she will strengthen yourself and become a man. Why is he saying this? Because there's a possibility here that King Solomon was much younger than we understand, or that he was a palace, he was protected by his mother, and this is why Adoniyahu thought that he could usurp, even though probably everyone knew King Solomon, or Solomon at the time was the one that was probably favored. And this is why Bathsheba had to intervene, because her son, maybe like Jacob, was a little bit more protected, and therefore there was a need here to educate him here in certain things. It says V'shamarta mishmeret, but then we have an insert here. So strengthen yourself, become a man. Reminds me a little bit of Joshua. In the book of Joshua, it actually says, Rak chazak ve'ematz. He says to him, we hear this twice from God and from the people. He says to him, it says in chapter 1, Joshua 1, verse 7, Rak chazak ve'ematz me'od. Just be strong and very courageous. So this kind of reminds me a little bit of this reference here. And the word ish, by the way, for example, in verse 5, Lo yityatzeh ish lefanecha, no man will stand before you, because you will be the man, and so on. So there's a bit of an echo here of what happens with Joshua. But he says to him, and this is why I personally think that there's a little bit of editing done here, but the references are from the original text. I don't think this was forcefully inserted. I think this was part of the text originally, because it's basing itself on a longer lineage or a longer history of how these speeches work. And he says in verse 3, V'shamarta et mishmeret Adonai, you will guard the gardening of the Lord, Elohecha, your God, lalechet b'drachav. Now this is very strongly reminiscent of the book of Deuteronomy, and you can look this up. Lalechet b'drachav, to walk in his ways, lishmor chukotav u'mitzvotav u'mishpatav ve'edotav, to guard his laws, his commandments, his rulings, and his testimonies. Kakatuv betorat Moshe, as written in the Torah of Moses. Kakatuv betorat Moshe might be a slightly latter language, because Torat Moshe, Sefer Torat Moshe, and so on. These are words that we find mostly in latter books. So this specific statement, Kakatuv betorat Moshe, might be an insert from a latter stage, because this strongly resembles the language of Chronicles. But again, it doesn't take away from the overall idea of what the original text was like. It could be that ve'edotav might have been asher tziva Moshe, as Moses commanded. Moshe, by the way, is rarely mentioned in any of Samuel Kings, so it's very unusual that it's here. But this still doesn't take away from the possibility that there was some reference to Moses, or some allusion to the Torah that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. But by saying Katuv b'Torat Moshe, it sharpens the comment that this is a reference to the book of Deuteronomy, and this is why the editorial work here is a little evident, at least with these three words. Because if you don't understand Alechet b'Drachav Lishmor, the first part of the verse, this solidifies it that we are referencing to the book of Deuteronomy. Lema'an taskil, for you will succeed. Et kol asher ta'aseh et kol asher tifneh sham, which all which you shall do, and anything that you will turn to there. Basically saying your success is by following God, and it strongly reminds me of the whole idea of wisdom writings. And there are scholars who want to argue that this section is really part of the wisdom writings. It says that if you read the beginning of Proverbs, I think it's first 9 chapters, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of it kind of revolves around this idea. And then it says in verse 4, "Leman yakim Adonai devo," for to ensure that the Lord will make or cause to happen. Kum really means to stand, but standing to erect, to cause something to be, His word. Asher diber alai, who spoke about me. Le'emor, saying, Im yishmeru vanecha et derkam. So this strongly connects back to the book of Samuel. If your sons will keep my their path. Lalechet lefanai be'emet. So they have to guard the way they walk. Again, very reminiscent of Psalm 1. אשרי האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת רשעים דרך חטאים לא עמד ומושב לצים לא ישב כי מתורת בני חפצו. He doesn't walk on the path of the wicked, and he only seeks the law of God. So this is very strongly reminiscent of the wisdom ideas also of Psalms. So walk before him in truth. B'chol levavam v'chol nafsham. Again, this reminds us of Deuteronomy 6. B'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha, or Deuteronomy 11. So again, very, very strong hints to that section. Le'emor, saying, Lo yikaret lecha ish me'al kisei Yisrael. No man will be cut off from upon the throne of Israel. So this also sends a unified idea of all of Israel. It doesn't say Judah and Israel, it says all of Israel. This, again, can be argued a little bit as a late editorial piece, because instead of Judah and Israel, which is the most common terminology we find in Samuel and Kings, referring to all of Israel as a unified principle is something which is, again, a very, very strong ideal that we find throughout the Bible. But if I do my work as a Bible scholar trying to find holes like this or material like this might be one of them as well. But then he turns over to the punishments, to the attacks on certain people, close off all these deals, all these issues that we had. And he says, cause damage to this person, let that person live, because he's also probably teaching him a lesson here about loyalty and overall. Strongly reminds me of Ezekiel 18. He says, if a person was righteous, then they will be blessed, but if they turn over to wickedness towards the end of their life, their righteousness will not be known, and vice versa as well. So we actually have this principle of, first of all, and this proves actually this is much earlier. This actually can be debated. Let's be more frank. This can be debated because this is all about personal responsibility and not national responsibility. And personal responsibility is something that is usually perceived more as late, but we can argue against that because we do find King David's personal responsibility, but also a national responsibility. So this is a little bit debatable, dating this section, because this is a lot about personal responsibility. But again, you can argue that personal responsibility, when you act something, God responds to you personally, and that the idea of that there was no personal interaction or personal guidance by God might, in earlier theology of the Bible, actually might not be correct. I mean, I've heard this argument many, many times, but I've actually found that this era, for example, in Egypt, the mentality in regards to your God was actually that you had a personal relationship with God. So I've said in the past that we don't see this, but I've looked more into also the surrounding cultures, and Egypt specifically came up as being a place where personal relationship exists, which means that we're not always necessarily seeing this as recorded in the Bible, because the Bible is talking more in larger scope. It doesn't mean that you don't have personal relationships, a personal relationship with your God. And if I've ever deterred someone by making the argument that you don't have a personal relationship with God, I apologize. I actually retract that statement that I made, and I think I made that statement over a year ago, and I retract that statement. I actually think that we do find much more compelling, I'm finding compelling evidence to the idea that people did perceive the concept of a personal God as well. And I apologize if I ever deterred someone about this, and I retract that comment. So this is an opportunity to correct something, and this will happen. And it's not uncommon for people to retract a comment or correct something throughout time when they study more, because it's a process. Learning is a process. So then he starts going over the people. So he says, "V'gam ata yadata et asher asa li Yoav ben Tzeruya." And you also know, yadata usually is past tense, but it also means here, it can also mean present tense. In this specific situation, it's present tense. You know that which Yoav, son of Tzeruya was his mother, very unusual case of someone being named after their mother. Asher asa l'shnei sarei tzvaot Yisrael, that he had done to the two ministers of war, the two generals basically of Israel, le'Avner ben Ner u'le'Amsa ben Yeter v'yahargen, to Avner son of Ner and to Amsa son of Yeter, and he killed them. We know the two stories. Avner came all the way to Hebron, and Yoav chased him down after he left Hebron and killed him, even though there was a peace agreement. And Amsa came late during the rebellion of Avshalom, and because he was late, Yoav thought that he was joining the rebellion, and he killed him. These were two people who killed for no reason. This is Yoav, who's a very violent person, very aggressive, very impulsive as well, overzealous for David to a point where the zealousness actually comes out in a very, very negative way. Vayasem demei milchama b'shalom, he placed blood of war in peace, meaning that at the time of peace he actually decided to put blood of war. I might be misunderstanding this, but it sounds like as if he places the blood of war during peace, which says this man is not really fitting for your kingship. It's supposed to be a kingship of peace. And he placed the blood of war, blood of violence in his belt, where he holds his sword. On the belt which is around his waist, and the shoes which are at his feet. The whole thing about the shoes here is there's a whole idea that we actually find the idea of during war your shoes get covered with blood. We also hear about, because if I'm not mistaken, we actually have if I'm not mistaken, when his own brother was murdered, he was left on the side of the road. There was something about standing over the body wearing your shoes. It doesn't say that specifically, but there's some interesting elements here of standing with your shoes over a dead body, maybe. It says, kechochmatecha, you do as your wisdom. There's a difference between chochmatcha and chochmatecha. It's a slight variation of vowel points. You will do as your wisdom, velot torej sevato b'shalom sheol, and he will not pass down his grayness, his old age, in peace to Sheol, in peace to the grave. He's not really he's not telling him directly to kill him, but he says make sure he doesn't go in peace, because what he did was terrible. It says ulivnei Barzilai hagiladi, and to the sons of Barzilai the Gileadite, because he actually helped King David when he had to flee. Ta'aseh chesed, you will do a kindness. Vayu be'ochle shulchanecha, they will be the ones who consume at your table. Basically, they come and go as they please. They are connected to you now. They will be close to you. Kichen karvu elai, for thus they drew near to me. Bevolchi b'nei Avshalom achicha, when I fled from your brother from the presence of Avshalom, your brother. They drew near. They took care of him. You take care of them. But the sons of Barzilai, which means Barzilai is probably not alive anymore. And it says, V'hinei immecha Shim'i ben Gera. So Shim'i ben Gera was another person. Shim'i was a person who cursed him. Ven HaYemini, the son of the Yemini of the tribe of Benjamin. Mi Bachurim, from the place known as Bachurim. V'hu kelelani ke'ala nimretzet b'yom lichti machanaim, and he cursed me a rapid curse. He stood on the same mountain and he cursed. If I remember correctly, he also threw rocks. On the day I went to Machanaim, which is when he fled from Avshalom, V'hu yarad likrati hayarden, and he came down towards me at the Jordan. V'eshava lo v'Adonai le'emor imametecha becharev, and I swore to him, I vowed to him by the name of the Lord. He actually used God's name. This is how oaths worked. And you can go. I have a short article about the issue of oaths, and there's a reference there to a larger book about oath formulas. He says, if I kill you with a sword, he threatened him and said, I will kill you with a sword if you carry on eventually. Though this slightly contradicts what we saw earlier, because if you go to the book of Samuel, it actually describes that he tells Avshalom not to kill him, but there's possibility here that we're looking here at a rapid reading, because then Shimei runs up forward, and David doesn't really respond too heavily to this, but we might be looking at another piece here where he actually did threaten him. But if I remember correctly, if you go back to Samuel and we go back to that occurrence, if I'm not mistaken, Shimei actually shows up at the head of a delegation and he apologizes. It says, so you go to 2 Samuel chapter 19 verse 20, and he says to him, Vayomer el hamelech al yachshov li adoni avon. He said to the king, please do not consider this to me as a crime, as a transgression. Val tizkor et asher ha'eva avdecha. Not remember that which your servant has transgressed. Vayom asher yatsa adoni hamelech miYerushalayim, which my lord the king came out from Jerusalem. Lasum hamelech el libo, to place upon his heart. And he goes on, he apologizes, and he says, and then you have Avishai, not Yoav. Avishai, verse 22, says he wants to kill him. And King David says, Vayomer David, Mali velachem b'nei Tzoria. This is verse 23. What is to me and to you, the sons of Tzeruya? Ki tiyu li hayom lesatan, that you will be a Satan, you will be an obstacle to me today. Hayom yumat ish b'Yisrael, today someone from Israel will die. Ki alo yadati, for I know. Ki hayom ani melech al Yisrael, for I know today I am king over Israel. Vayomer hamelech el Shimei, lo tamut. And the king said to Shimei, will not die. Vayishava lo hamelech, and the king vowed to him. So here, you can read this in two different ways. One way of reading is Vayishava lo lemor im amitecha b'charev. He vowed to him and he said, if I will not, I will kill you with a sword. So if you don't have the context of chapter 19, verse 23 and 24, it looks like as if this is a threat, saying, I will do such a thing. The im is really to reaffirm this. But however, King David said, I can't punish him because I vowed to him that I won't kill him. So he says to him, Ve'ata al tenakehu, but now do not make him clean. The root nakah here, it's an interesting thing. I had an interesting discussion with my Akkadian professor about this word, because the idea is that when something is found in trial without fault, or something, there's no claim over something, it's referred to as naki, as clean. And we were specifically talking about a document that deals with a legal matter that has to do with a field that there's no claim to it. So the officials, this was a kind of like a made-up sentence, but it reflects a real thing that could be used in Akkadian, where it says that the officials of the city were reviewing something about a person, and they concluded that the field was clean. And the clean means that there's no legal claim here. Here he says to him, now, do not find him clean. Actually make the statement that there's a legal argument against him because of what he did. Ki ish chachamata, for you are a wise man. He's again saying to him, you have wisdom. Which is interesting because later on we hear about him asking for wisdom. So there might be a little stages mixed in here together, maybe some inserts of words. Interesting question. Or maybe he was wise to begin with, and because he was wise, he knew to ask for more wisdom. Vayadata et asher ta'aseh lo, and you will know that which you will do to him. V'horata et sevato bedam sheol, and you will send down his old age by blood, violence, death, to Sheol. So it says, then this is the end of what he says to him. And now we go on basically to describing the end of the reign of King David. Vayishkav David im avotav v'kaver be'ir David, and David lay down with his fathers, and he was buried in the city of David. When there actually is a place in the city of David of today called the burial sites of the kings. This is why arguing that the tomb of David that is known today on Mount Zion is the tomb of David is not true. It would not be true. There's no way of doing that. Ir David is very, very specific. There was no construction in the area of Mount Zion of today. During this period, the city of David was limited to the Ophel, to the area that goes down from the Temple Mount of today. Maybe a little bit construction here and there, but Mount Zion is something that we know was only really occupied and only partially occupied during the second half of the first temple. So don't go looking for the tomb of King David up on Mount Zion. You need to look for his tomb somewhere else, which is in the city of David. And it gives us a summary. Vayamim asher malach David al Yisrael, in the days, which means years, that King David ruled over Israel. 40 shana, 40 years. And these 40 years were divided up into two segments. Bechevron malach sheva shanim, in Hebron he reigned for 7 years. Uvirushalayim malach sheloshim v'shalosh shanim, and in Jerusalem he reigned for 33 years. So remember, 40 is a perfect number. And King Solomon also reigns for 40 years, which is a perfect number as well. But here we actually have a really precise record of his kingship. By the way, this also, by the way, means that he died at the age of 70, from what we know. And though I don't think it specifically states that he was 70, I think tradition says that he was that he was 70. But if he was 70, then he had to be older when he fought. Well, there's a bit of a problem because he was around probably a young man, 17, 18 years old when he fought Goliath, and then he becomes indoctrinated into Saul's army, but then he becomes king around the age of 30, which means that we have a lapse here of about over 10 years, which means that this again contribute to the question of how long did King Saul actually reign, and most people go over on the area of 10 years. This is an extra point. And it ends it by establishing that what King David wanted to happen actually happened. Shlomo yashav al kiseh David aviv, and Solomon sat on the throne of David his father. Vatikon malchuto me'od, and his kingship was greatly established. This is more of a statement for King David that the promise that was made to him was fulfilled. However, unfortunately, later on, King Solomon does make mistakes along the way, and there's difficulties. But the statement itself is here to establish the idea that if King Solomon does what was said in the beginning, what's described at the end should also happen as well. I hope you enjoyed this recording. And again, always, you can go to HebrewInIsrael.net for the rest of the recordings, and you can also look me up on iTunes and Facebook, Hebrew in Israel. You can email me at HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com if you have any specific questions. And as always, if what I've done here has blessed you, please consider contributing to be able to get more material and find time to research this material. And more importantly, don't forget to share with your friends, have discussions, increase your knowledge, and become wiser. Kol Tov.